Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
Hello, Quiet Writers. Andreou here. As promised, here is the full 40 minutes of the discussion with Luke McGee and Salma Shah, which had to be edited down for the main episode, about the future of NATO, but also more generally the ambivalent stance adopted by the states towards countries which have regarded it traditionally as an ally. It is a question worth asking, not because of some theory that Putin is controlling Trump somehow. It's possible, I guess, but it seems to me like quite a comforting reading of the situation, because it's easier to fathom some evil Spectre plot involving compromat sleeper agents and grooming Trump as an asset, so that the US ends up subordinate to Russia. The more difficult version of events is that they are willing partners because their values align. Because Trump, Musk, J.D. Vance, they see Putin as a defender of straight, white, Christian, male, oligarch privilege, and European democracies as woke. That is, in my view, a more complex, but more likely and much more disturbing possibility. As I put this out on Friday morning, there has been a ramping up of the rhetoric from Trump, calling Zelensky a dictator on Wednesday night, followed by a meeting between Zelensky and the US envoy to Russia and Ukraine, after which the US side cancelled the planned press conference. Zelensky did put out a statement after the event, which softened his language a little bit. On Thursday night, under the auspices of CPAC, Steve Bannon delivered a nakedly fascist and violent speech, capped with a fascist salute, of course, and an incoherent and slurring Elon Musk took to the stage, brandishing a chainsaw and accusing Zelensky of continuing the war for bribes. And the strange thing is that none of this merits any additional comment. None of this moves the dial at all. It is the new normal of that administration. Oh, and Kemi Badenoch finally condemned Trump. Better late than never, I suppose. And in that strange, strident, tone-deaf way of hers, she did so as if she had been saying this for days, and her position had never been in doubt, rather than dithering for a week, echoing J.D. Vance's inane speech and babbling about pronouns. She ended her post with, "Starmer should get on with it, get on a plane to Washington and show some leadership." A pretty strange thing to say 3 days after Starmer had already announced a visit to Washington next week. Anyway, here is the full conversation.
Quiet Riot.
As you know, this podcast likes to give you light and shade, balance, hope, but never unreality. And in the current reality, I am finding light very scarce and balance or hope hard to sustain. As we watch the final episodes of The Traitor's Nuclear War edition unfold, it seems only last month that America held Ukraine's hands, looked her in the eyes and said, "I promise you I am faithful." It seems ironic that after decades of paranoia about Reds under the bed, the American people appear to have neglected to check with whom they were getting into bed. With every press conference, Trump seems to become more aggressive, blame Ukraine for being invaded, adopt yet another Kremlin talking point. This was his latest as we record on Wednesday.
I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it.
Who knew? All Ukraine had to do to end the war was lose. Luke, this used to be your beat for CNN, right, for many years. Give us a sense of the magnitude of this shift of policy.
I think we're now at what is really a very risky moment. Now, we've discussed before recording, you and I have slightly different opinions. I'm of the view, as lots of people in the kind of diplomatic and security and defence world are, that something needed to happen, right? Yes, the West had been supporting Ukraine. Yes, America had been providing a huge amount of military aid and money to Ukraine. But the war was not looking like it was going to end anytime soon. And in order for negotiations to start, in order for us to even start seeing an end point, something needed to happen. Now, that something happens to be Donald Trump. I think it's incredibly dangerous as he has removed stakeholders from the conversation, because
that's never
really
a good idea.
It really could go one of two ways at the moment. However, my view on this is you can't say for months and months and months that something needs to happen and then just throw your arms up in the air when something does happen. Yeah. So I think we do have to try where we can to see what merit there might be in his approach to these things. Now, look, I, like you all, have watched for the last nearly 3 years a country be invaded unprovoked and bravely fight off this invasion. And hearing the sorts of things Donald Trump has been saying in the last week is horrifying. But an old contact of mine who worked in both the White House and State Department under Obama always used to say, you can't wish a different world into existence. So I think as risky as it all feels, we are where we are and something is finally happening.
Do you think that a Democratic presidency would have brought it to bear in this way?
If Biden had stayed on, I don't see he would have changed his policy, and I can't particularly see what Harris would have done differently, no.
Can I ask something actually on that? Where are the Democrats? The silence has been deafening. I have not seen a single thing from anyone senior. Like you say, it is a dangerous moment. And in an adversarial system, two-party system like America, you kind of rely on a decent opposition being around as well. And I think just the complete absence makes it an even more dangerous moment, doesn't it? Why do you think they're so reticent?
I think Pete Buttigieg has said a couple of things, but I think it's that they got so comprehensively beaten. This time Trump won the popular vote. He won both houses. You think back to 2016 and he had opposition not just in the form of the Democrats, he had opposition in the form of the GOP. He had people who didn't want to serve under him. Now he is the GOP establishment, and they've comprehensively won the argument in America. And I think when you're in opposition, you either actually do rally around the flag or you fall apart. And it seems to me that
the margins are small, and I'm a little bit conscious that the comprehensively one thing is slightly a Trump talking point rather than
that might be, but I think Luke's point on the retreat of the Dems in opposition because they don't feel like they can argue it, because they're opening themselves up for more attack from Trump, I would suggest, and it just sort of compounds the defeat. You see it, all the time when you have new governments and, the previous occupants. We see it in sort of the Conservative Party now in this country, is that they don't feel like they really have a leg to stand on because everything is still so recent and so fresh. So, so many people will criticise Biden's policy in Ukraine. They will talk about actually the bigger threat being China, for example. And I think actually, and I'd be keen to understand your view, Luke, because, where we sit in Europe, where we don't have a consistent approach to Ukraine either, it feels as if our sort of traditional special relationship, or however you want to term it, with the US, it feels like that is breaking apart as well, because the Russian threat is more pertinent to us, but it's not to them. And it feels like they just want it off their desks to be able to focus on other things that are more important.
Just to come back to the previous point, I think if you're a mainstream Democrat right now, it must feel very hard not to feel irrelevant. In terms of the transatlantic alliance, look, I'm one of these people, the late Christopher Mayer, who was a former British ambassador to America, always used to say the special relationship never existed, right? I think that's probably true. I think American interest in Europe has always been somewhat overstated. If you look back to 1949 and the foundation of NATO, the Americans didn't particularly want to do it. They had to be convinced that it was in their best interest to protect the investment they'd made through the Marshall Plan, right? Then you have the Cold War, and there is obviously a lot of what we kind of talk about now as systemic rivalries of the Soviet system versus the West, and there was more interest during that period. Post-Soviet and then post really war on terror, the idea of America retreating from the world. I don't think it's a particularly new thing. I think American interest in Europe's been moving for quite a long time, and that's possibly now just extended to American involvement in the rest of the world.
Isn't there a dose of sort of historical revisionism bundled in with all this? Because there is this sense that Europe has been freeloading on the United States for its defense for decades. And I mean, the closer to now you come, the more it is true, absolutely. But like you say, the states had to be convinced to enter into this and were given significant inducements to do so, right? The main one being that the dollar was made reserve currency, which was a gigantic boon to them as a country. And the vast majority of conflicts that we have been involved in have been American conflicts, whether as a coalition of the willing or as NATO. They have been to protect American interests. Veterans in Gloucester and Belgium do a get-together every year because they fought together in Vietnam. There are very few conflicts in which it was Europe that has asked the states to intervene in order to protect them. We tend to go into war with the Americans.
And that's something that people are thinking about at NATO HQ a lot at the moment, that for all of the apparent American lack of interest in Europe, you know, the one example of Article 5 being invoked was the war on terror.
And the other bit of it actually is that my recollection is that for the last at least 20 years, whenever the idea of a European army was floated, the main objector was NATO and the countries who feel very aligned to NATO, like the UK and the US, because they saw that as a threat to NATO as the main force of protection. So to then suddenly turn around 2 years later and say, why don't you have your own bloody European army? When you are the ones that have been objecting to it for years, for decades.
The MAGA movement and the Trump movement in and of itself is inconsistent with established American foreign policy, except for the fact that, you know, even Kennedy was talking about the fact that the Europeans couldn't live off the fat of the land, and that they needed to basically address balance of payments issue and pay more towards their defence. So there has been this issue around it. And against the threat of the Soviets, our way of life, as it was always described, was the reasoning behind NATO and the strength and that alliance. I do think it's interesting because of these arguments that are surfacing. It is inconsistent with what we have understood, what our alignment has been. The worry for me is that we are now entering, as a consequence of this multipolar world, when we have been so used to having this single dominant entity in the US. And what does that actually mean for geopolitics now?
I was slightly worried you were going to say a bipolar world then. Which...
well,
yeah, it could be a bipolar world.
The question
in
is,
all
are we in the manic stage or the depressive stage right now?
I think those are all reasonable points, and a lot of it does come down to the way that institutions work, which isn't the most interesting answer. But when people talk about a European army, it usually had a kind of underpinning of the idea that the EU would somehow be involved. And there is, particularly in Western European states, a lot of resistance to the idea of the EU controlling any kind of military budgets, and also institutionally and operationally, how would NATO interact with that? But I think, the benefits to America of going into this alliance, and the transatlantic alliance existed, coming back to your point about previous wars, is that if you were to take a sort of American exceptionalist American view of the world, it was that they, felt they did have proxies. And I suppose you could say if European armies aren't arming themselves properly, then what's the purpose of that?
And bases, Luke.
And
I think
bases,
this is really an understood point, right? If America doesn't have any bases in Greece, in Turkey, in Malta, where is your presence if something happens to Israel? Where's your closest ship? Where's your closest aircraft?
I actually, I had an article out in Foreign Policy last week where I interviewed a former fairly senior US soldier, and he was saying the problem with this idea of withdrawal of thousands and thousands of troops is there's nowhere for them to go, right? And the European bases, as you say, they're not just for Europe, right? They're a forward advancement point. So if you're based geographically closer to Asia, then it serves double purpose. So I think strategically, I mean, I should just say I'm the one coming out sort of sounding like I'm in favour of what Trump's saying, which I'm absolutely not. I think it's a strategical nightmare.
No, I mean, I get what you're saying. You're saying it's a catalyst for the situation to unclog that has been clogged. But my issue with the debate that's been going on the last few days is that the media seems to have picked up the point and examined it sort of on its own merit. This is where we are, this is what's being proposed, etc., etc. But there is such a thing as right and wrong. Ukraine is the country that was invaded, and that seems to me to be being erased from this debate, that Russia was the aggressor here.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that was... I mean, there were a few awful things that were said, but that was the one that I think a country was attacked and invaded unprovoked.
Yeah.
And this is where I have the most sympathy for Zelensky, in fact, is he was told at the start, we're with you to the end.
Yeah.
And to some extent, he has to take that at face value. And now we're possibly learning what the end really meant.
Quiet Riot. Now at Verizon Business, every business can get the new Samsung Galaxy S25 Plus. Whether you're a new customer, loyal customer, or returning customer, this one's for you, you, and you on America's most reliable 5G network. Get the new Galaxy S25 Plus on us, powered by Verizon Business. 256 gigabyte on us. New device payment purchase agreement, select trade-in, and business unlimited plan required. Credit varies by smartphone trade-in. Applied to account over agreement term up to 36 months. Terms apply. Limited time offer.
Quiet Riot. People like Marco Rubio were quite critical of Putin at the beginning, and they seem to have had this, volte-face. He certainly has. Is this a negotiation play? Is this because they need to get people around the table? Is there anything sort of behind the scenes that we're missing that really is about that sort of diplomatic interaction as opposed to what we actually want as the outcome?
What I think is true in the situation as it exists today, it's categorically in the interest of both parties for there to be a peace deal. Russia.
Sorry, both parties, but who do you mean? Because that's the problem now.
Ukraine and Russia.
Right, okay.
A peace deal can't exist without Russian buy-in, and Russia was always going to be the harder side to bring to the table. Now, and if you look at this, and I happen to disagree with this view, but if you look at it from the Russian perspective, it's been maximum hostility from the West since the start. It is plausible that people around Trump have said there needed to be an overture. It could have been that they said if Ukraine and Europeans were at the table to begin with, the Russians wouldn't come. And I think those are sort of credible arguments. But, the risk of that is that you keep them outside the tent and the whole thing falls apart when it comes on contact with reality.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think there is a way of separating the two, right? Of saying that regularizing diplomatic relations with Russia is objectively a good thing. We want the two biggest nuclear states in the world to have a sort of dialogue. But if you look at the way Trump has always negotiated, his approach is always maximalist. So he will make the most shocking position at the very beginning and then concede bits and pieces as people negotiate those away. On this occasion, he's done exactly the opposite. He's made maximum concessions to begin with. And I look at that and I genuinely wonder, who are the sides of the negotiations? Because it seems to me the meeting was a meeting of the two people who will be on one side of this, coordinating their approach, and then they will speak to Ukraine and Europe, who are the people they're negotiating with.
The thing I struggle with on this is there a grand overarching strategy, or is he just kind of winging it? Coming back to your point about Rubio, which I think's really interesting, and I couldn't profess to know what's going on inside the head of Marco Rubio.
Well, we know what was going on inside his head a couple of years ago when he tweeted, and I quote, "Putin still wants to capture Kyiv and install a puppet government, but when he realizes that's not feasible, he will offer a ceasefire that imposes neutrality on Ukraine and recognizes Crimea and Donbass as part of Russia. Many in the West still don't understand that Putin is an expert liar. He seems to have had a fairly clear-eyed view of this in 22.
So I worked for CNN for 8 years. And one of the things that I always take from my first year there was the level of deference that Americans have to the executive is I can't think of a democracy like it. I can imagine someone like Marco Rubio might just think, well, that's the opinion of the president. So what I personally think isn't that important anymore. Maybe that's what's going on. I couldn't profess to know. I was asked by a comedian, pardon my language, are we now in a situation where America is Russia's bitch? And I sort of said, that's funny, but I don't think that is the case. But it's certainly clear that there are people around Donald Trump who are conventionally Russia hawks. There are also people around him who have absolutely swallowed Kremlin talking points and get their information from weird accounts on X. I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah, and there are people around him like Tulsi Gabbard, who he wants to put in charge of intelligence, about whom there is an active conversation in UK intelligence still ongoing as to whether she's an actual Russian asset. And so we are through the looking glass.
The world is very topsy-turvy on this, certainly, and everything that we had assumed that we could depend on in terms of alliances and positions and certainties, I think, in foreign policy has definitely changed. I do think the Rubio thing is interesting. I can't imagine that he would have gone from having, if you look at those tweets, such a clear-eyed view as to the strategy to just suddenly decide.
Views he'd held for a really long time as well.
Yeah, so maybe he is, as it were, following the president's orders, but he will be the person in the middle that will perhaps call time on anything that's too crazy. I mean, I'm living in hope rather than any knowledge.
I mean, that's possible, but
because you also have to have diplomacy with your own side in some instances to manage it. To have to trust. If he needs to go and have that chat with Sergei Lavrov, Lavrov needs to feel that he's going to speak to somebody who's there with an open mind.
Yeah.
The wider question is always going to be, if the Trump White House just wants this off their desk for the rest of this presidency, they don't want to have this as a sort of running sore. Do they really understand the longer term implications for Europe or care for European security? And, whilst they want us to defend ourselves and pay more towards NATO and take up more responsibility in what looks like a retreat from the world after, the last 40 years, it is fascinating to me to look at where principles sit in politics. And it goes back to that question of the aggressor looks like they will win something.
I think the really interesting follow-up is, if that is how this goes, what message does that send to China about Taiwan?
Yes.
One of the hardest things to do because of the way that American politics works and the way that the domestic politics dominates absolutely all of the debate over there is explaining clearly to the American voters why their tax dollars should be spent somewhere else. I wonder if the question about China, given how much paranoia there is in America about China, is the way to explain that sometimes.
But we're going to have that conversation here, because if you think...
Well, we have to now.
But we have to now, because if you think that the Treasury, according to reports, is modelling 11% cuts across non-protected departments, there will be people today who will say, why am I paying to defend Ukraine? And that's how they will see it. And when their public services are not functioning and their prime minister is going and committing troops, boots on the ground as a peacekeeping force, there will be a reaction to that.
I mean, I have to say that this is an aspect of it in which I think the Conservatives and conservative thinking in general is in a bit of a muddle, in that they're always reaching for that spirit of the 1940s. But no one was going, hang on a minute, Mr. Churchill, how are we going to pay for this? The point is, wartime, I mean, that's what financial instruments were created for. Quite literally, that's what financial instruments were created for. And I have seen in the monetarist circles of both the European Union and the UK that there's several discussions about how suddenly central banks might find a way to release quite a lot of funding into their economies for specifically these purposes and maybe lower their demands on fiscal rules and things like that.
Hasn't it? The
Well,
EU
it has, but I think it's going to move further in that direction. According to Kim Darroch, a former US ambassador for the UK, Keir Starmer has ended up in a sort of pivotal bridging position. Let's have a listen to what he said.
Keir Starmer was a prominent figure at yesterday's emergency meeting of European leaders. He is the first one to, as it were, break cover and say that he'd be prepared to deploy British troops to some sort of force on the ground in Ukraine. And that gives him, I think, a certain credibility to get through the door in the White House and to be listened to. He's offered to host a follow-up meeting to the Paris meeting after he's seen Trump. So he's become quite quickly rather a pivotal figure for Europe in this.
Salma, what do you think he can achieve with his visit
I'm
to Washington?
baffled about this, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
because it's so it's really out of style for Starmer, isn't it? To be like, I'm going to go put boots on the ground in Ukraine. It was like, whoa, really? What happened to you? Secondly, he's sort of betting a lot on having the gumption to be able to go negotiate with the self-styled arch negotiator in the form of President Trump. So he must have had some kind of intelligence that says they're willing and open to have this conversation. He's also not the first person to have raised this. So when this broke, I called my great friend Latika Bork, who you might know, Australian journalist, does a lot in the defence space. And she said, funnily enough, actually Macron said it first about the peacekeeping force. So we're sort of surprisingly more aligned with the French in Europe on this. But Starmer has obviously decided that he's going to throw down the gauntlet to Europe. He's going to lead the charge and go over to Washington. But I can't imagine that Mr. Cautious has done this without thinking that there is a strong chance or having some kind of information that there's a strong chance that it's going to be met positively. So that was my first reaction to it, which was like, I hope you're right. You're taking the right bet. But I'm not, just to say, I'm also not averse to what he said. I know there will be a lot of people that will say, why are we committing British troops? But I also think this will be an interesting test for the Conservatives on this as well, in terms of what position they take, because reform will be against it.
It will be something pronouns. I mean, I can tell you what their position will be. It will be something about trans rights.
Well, I think they'll say, they'll take the MAGA view, which is we should spend here first. This is where our priority should be.
Quiet Riot. And we're back with Canva Presents Secret Sounds Work Edition. Caller, guess this sound.
It's a mouse click.
So close. That's actually publishing a website with Canva Docs. Next caller.
Definitely a mouse click.
Nice try. It was sorting 100 sticky notes with a Canva whiteboard. We also would have accepted resizing a Canva video into 10 different sizes.
What? No way.
Yes way. One click can go a long way. Love your work at canva.com.
Quiet Riot. On the question of troops on the ground, so I'm going to plug my own work here. I actually first reported this in November as an exclusive that it was being talked about, Brits going down. Annoyingly, Le Monde got out ahead of me because of...
Classic French.
Yeah. But so the conversation has been for a while in European defence circles that if there is a peace deal, there's going to have to be a buffer zone, and there will have to be some kind of peacekeepers on that. Now, we can have a separate conversation about what the difference between peacekeepers and peace enforcers. But that's a separate conversation, but that's a very important one, and I think Starmer probably needs to be entirely clear about that. But the idea was there would have to be troops. They weren't going to be... So the process of elimination ended up with the Brits, basically. Yeah. So it wouldn't be the Americans. In order for it to be credible, it needed a nuclear power in there. So that leaves France and Britain. France is politically in a not that strong position, whereas however chaotic you think things are in Britain at the moment, it's a government with a majority and 4 and a bit years left.
Yeah.
So it was always the case, and it was always assumed among defence circles that it would be the Brits. And I would be very surprised if that information hadn't been passed on to Starmer.
In the second leg of your question, Salma, I've always thought it was entirely a normal thing between Trump and Starmer because I think the people Trump likes most are lawyers. Like his entire coterie is lawyers. He knows how to talk to them. He may consider them, tallocacious pussies, but he knows how to deal with them.
Yeah, but hold on.
Yeah.
American lawyers, corporate lawyers, are very, very different to British barristers who've been in public life. What I'm saying is...
The function they perform, though, is
assume,
the same. It is what is possible within the limits, right?
I promise you, British legal, the sort of legal function of the state does not operate into the art of the possible, in my experience. They are very much the letter of the law.
I think he might like that even more. I think he might consider that even more authentic Downton Abbey. No, seriously, he has an affinity for this country.
But let's assume that you're correct and Trump likes lawyers because they deal with the art of the possible. I think he might be a little bit disappointed then with Starmer's.
He has met him several times, and he speaks about him in terms that he speaks about nobody else.
But I think it's because he thinks he works for the king.
That's okay. He does, kinda. Right. Okay, what's next? Is NATO even a thing right now, Luke? I'm asking that. I'm not being facetious.
We know that it's a thing, but is it going to continue to be a thing?
Article 1 is about not being aggressive and coercive with your NATO partners, and we have Greenland going on. Article 5 is about a sense of solidarity. There is a weird logical inconsistency in America demanding that we commit to a project. As it says, I'm not particularly committed to it.
So, you mentioned Article 1 and Article 5. I think, and there's no one has said this to me, this is my own view of the, I feel like both of those articles are aspirational and there's a bit of wiggle room. I think the exact wording of Article 1 is that they will attempt to act peacefully or something to that effect. And there's a huge amount of wiggle room in Article 5. I mean, I don't have the exact wording in front of me, and an astonishingly small number of journalists who have big opinions on it seem to have read about 300 words that's very readily available online, but it's effectively, to act what you believe to be proportionately to support an ally. I would just come back to you and say, what do you mean when you say, does NATO exist? And I'm not trying to be facetious. I just think that there's a few different ways to answer that question.
Can we rely on being on the same page as America in terms of geopolitics, in terms of defense? Latika Burke wrote a fantastic article only yesterday in which she said that the wider message, actually, if you look at the J.D. Vance speech, is that philosophically, the Trump White House feels more of an affinity with Putin's Russia than it does with the liberal democracies of Europe. And it's really hard not to take that point.
I think, just to make a side point, actually, because you mentioned the J.D. Vance speech, I thought the most alarming part of yesterday and the Vance speech was when Vance was criticising Romania for cancelling elections because of Russian interference. Yep. And then Trump yesterday says, Ukraine needs elections.
Yeah.
I genuinely found that chilling.
Because that goes beyond the borders frozen as they are, right? This potentially hands Putin another sock puppet state like Belarus.
And I certainly don't see that the Kremlin wouldn't take that opportunity to interfere in an election. And if America legitimizes that election, then we really are in different territory. But that's speculation.
Yeah.
Look, I think the thing with NATO is chatting to a fairly senior person in NATO last week, and they were saying, look, in some respects, Article 5 kind of clouds all of the work that we do, right? So they do things on capability targets, right? So they do things where they set tasks for allies to have, for specific scenarios, there'll be a certain number of troops that go here, and they try to make sure that they don't all replicate each other. And then there's the interconnectivity part of it, right? They talk about procurement quite a lot. So there's a deal start of last year where NATO effectively brokered a deal where it was Germany, Netherlands and Spain. It was a $5.5 billion deal, bought 1,000 Patriots. The contract was given to a German and American company. And as part of the deal, a factory would be opened in Germany.
Yeah,
right?
they make parts for each other,
and
etc.
it moves the money around, and that's probably a more accurate reflection of what NATO is, right? It's like, I don't know if you were fans of 24, but Jack Bauer says, I exist because I don't want people like me to exist, right? And NATO and Article 5 exist not to be used. So in some respects, they kind of cloud a lot of what NATO does, I think.
Hold on, because that means if the power of it is in the possibility of it, then if you disavow the possibility and say, these people don't pay, I'm not going to protect them, then you've already invalidated the treaty for an aggressor. I mean, in the eyes of Putin, is Putin going to have any confidence right now that the US would intervene if he went into Estonia? That's the simple question, I guess.
What is it about the treaties that would impel them to do it?
Forget impel them to do it.
My response to that is that for NATO to mean something, it needs to be a credible deterrent. The way we think about things at the moment with regards to, does the US do this? Does Europe do this? The answer to this is no one knows, right? Because it hasn't reached that point yet. This war has not spilled beyond Ukraine's borders into a NATO state. We need to stop thinking if one thing happens, something else has to happen. The truth of this is it works in a cycle, you know. For the Americans to stay interested in Europe, the European NATO allies need to keep doing these things like moving money around the alliance, like making an alliance with European partners, appealing to American taxpayers, appealing to American politicians. So I don't think we're at that point. And I think there are far more sort of fundamental questions about the intentions of the US president than anything to do with NATO, because I think ultimately that's more important.
Yeah, I think that's a really elegant way to duck the question, to be honest. 5 years ago, I would have some confidence, even if it was an illusion, that if there was aggression aimed at a European NATO state from Russia, then America would broadly be on Europe's side, and I don't have that confidence anymore. Should I? Have you seen anything that points to America being at all interested?
It's not an easy question to answer. I don't know. The answer to that isn't to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use a horrible metaphor.
I think you raise an important point, which is how do you keep that alliance together? If that can be reneged upon, does that make us less secure? I think the only thing that gives me hope on it is even under the Biden administration, or despite the fact that it was under the Biden administration, I think the worry about the escalation, you know, when there were missiles accidentally fired into Poland, for example, the fact that it was a NATO country, I think it spooked enough people for it to be an issue, for NATO to still have that power, for it to still create questions in Moscow as to how they behave. I also think that as part of the negotiation, Ukraine's joining NATO for Russia will have to be off the table because it is still such a credible threat, and the fact that it could be acted upon. I don't think it's just one man with one administration in the White House that will control it. And I think we have to, if nothing else, have some confidence in our institutions and the many thousands of people that contribute to that. We have this illusion in Western liberal democracies about one person sitting at the top making these choices, whether it's the Prime Minister or the President or whatever else. But it's not. There has to be some kind of groundswell. And at the moment, the groundswell is against us and pro-Trump and pro-Putin. And I say us in terms of we're not thinking necessarily about domestic. We are thinking about international and what the change in the world order will mean for us in the long term. But I do think we have to accept that the populace is not where we might be. And it emboldens Trump and Trump's White House to make those choices that we don't necessarily think are long-term enough.
Okay, well, let's end it with a domestic question then. Kemi Badenoch gave a speech on Tuesday in the middle of all this going on. Let's have a listen.
As the world becomes more complicated, we need to bravely fight for these values now. Instead, we are distracted, too busy critiquing and deconstructing what previous generations built, rather than making sure that the very best of our inheritance is left intact for the next generation. This is the real poison of left-wing progressivism. Whether it's pronouns or DEI or climate activism, these issues aren't about kindness. They are about control.
Salma, this one is for you. Parts of the right in this country seem to me to have embraced the Trump administration with quite a lot of zest. What do you think that means for our domestic politics?
I think it's sort of troubling because you have this split in the right, and what used to be a centre-right party in the Conservatives doesn't quite understand where it needs to go in terms of trying to win back the trust of the electorate. And I think the difficulty is that when you see a winner, you want to emulate what that winner is doing. And so they're trying to take lessons from Trump, and they're trying to kind of like associate with the Trump White House. But they could also take lessons from the Canadian right as well. And so it's that association with winning, I think, and that emulating of that win without necessarily taking a step back and saying, how does that actually apply to this context? And it's very knee-jerk. So I think Kemi's response is very knee-jerk for things that she feels at a very surface level, but hasn't really thought through the strategic consequences of. So aligning yourself to reform and trying to be reform, it's not really going to work.
And also opinion polls don't reflect it. So this is the bit I don't get. It's almost like Kemi Badenoch thinks MAGA X is an accurate reflection of British public opinion.
Yeah, I think she would regard herself as a conviction politician. The depth is lacking in terms of strategic depth and articulating an intellectual position on what conservatism is going to mean for the future.
Yeah.
Quiet riot.
So there you have it. I hope you found that useful. On reflection, I think Salma's reading that Trump just wants a quick deal as the primary motivating factor is of some value. The problem is that quick deals come at a high cost, and the country paying the cost is not the country that wants a quick deal, is not even at the table. That creates some pretty perverse incentives. And I also have much sympathy with Luke's realpolitik aphorism that we cannot wish a different world into existence. That's true, but that doesn't mean we must acquiesce to the world as it currently is. We may not be able to wish a different world into existence, but we can work towards it. This was Alex Andreou. I'll see you for Sunday school. Ciao!
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou, and produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu, and edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet riot.